I feel pretty confident in saying that D&D is a shared universe. Yeah, if you think about like D&D's past, you think about decades of guidebooks and rules and games being played and people taking the content that they made for those games and then publishing it in the books that we have now, right? A lot of that early D&D content was just things people used in their games, right? Like all of those spells were spells that they designed at the table as they made characters and created this game. And we also even have just like a bunch of fiction that people have written, a lot of novels where items from those novels are now in the system itself. And so it's all of this shared content boiled down and made into a system that we all use, that we all have our games in. It's a fantasy world that we all interact with every time we play. But I'm not really a huge fan of shared universes. And so I wanted to talk about taking that shared universe that is Dungeons & Dragons and narrowing it down and refining it a bit into a more standalone universe, or at least a universe that feels more standalone. Because I think I really prefer standalone universes. I find them much more intentional, I find the stories much more intimate, and I find the history much richer, even though there is oftentimes less of it. You have this history of interaction in standalone universes that you don't really get in shared universes. If you think of like Marvel and you think of Thor and Iron Man, you think of their history, their backstory, there's not a lot of interaction between them. It's just Thor's history and Iron Man's history. But if you think about a standalone universe like Lord of the Rings or something, right, you have this very long history of elves and dwarves interacting. You have this very long history of threats of the world, and that provides a lot of context for the story. That's one of the things about standalone universes is they provide context for stories that can change, a character's, an audience member's, or a player's opinion on what is going on. And for me, that's very important in my storytelling. I feel like history background is often like a subplot in and of itself that gets revealed slowly over the course of a story, and that adds a lot to a story. The reason I started thinking about this is I was watching the show Invincible, and if you're sick of hearing about it, I'm going to talk about this for 15 seconds. There won't be spoilers. And the thing about Invincible is that they take a standalone universe and they make it feel more like a shared universe, which is kind of interesting to me. It's almost like a satire of all of the Marvel and DC stuff. And I was thinking like, well, could you take a shared universe and make it feel more standalone? And I realized that I have been doing that in my games. I just haven't really put names on things. These systems that I've developed in my mind that I have been using, take that D&D universe, that shared universe, and turn it more into a standalone universe. And so I took those systems that I realized I had almost been subconsciously using and put a name on them so I can use them a little bit more intentionally and hopefully help someone else out there use them more intentionally. And I'll start with an example. Where did the Horn of Blasting come from? It was originally in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide, but where does it come from in our world, right? It doesn't come from anywhere. This is what I mean when I say that Dungeons & Dragons is a shared universe. We just have things that sort of manifest themselves and exist in the universe because they were in a game at some point, but they don't really have any history. Even like the dwarven armor, well, that has some history. We know that it was made by dwarves, but why was it made? Right? Like what type of dwarf made it? Again, we don't really have history to things. But if it did have history, it would provide context, and it would provide that feeling like the world has existed for a long time, like there's been things happening in it, like there's been interaction between various cultures and groups wanting to do whatever they want to do in your world, take over the world, right? And I realized that in my own writing, in my own world building, I leave these sort of like creation pockets in my world to filter items through, to filter events through, and things and people and whatever, locations. And what I mean when I say a creation pocket is essentially like a blank space in history with a overarching theme. Okay, example within an example. So in my own world's lore, there was this huge war, but this was essentially like a war for the realm that lasted many, many years and saw houses rise and fall over the course of it, and was only ended because of intervention from the current administration of gods. And so when I want to give something like a Horn of Blasting, something from D&D's shared universe that has no history, when I want to give it to my players, I can say, oh, well, this came from one of these houses that rose and fell during this war that we all know about that has such an expansive history that we can't even dig into it all, that it hasn't even all been written down. When they go to a location that are ruins, they aren't just like some ruins, right? They are one of the old ruins of one of the fallen houses in the world, and the magic items they find in those ruins will tell whatever history I decided to write on the fly 5 minutes before the session to describe what has happened there, right? So maybe that Horn of Blasting isn't necessarily a Horn of Blasting. Maybe it does the same thing, but it's actually like the Royal Horn of House Landport or something, right? And now it has a history behind it. I could have like the heir of that house that has been being led by his old family's ghosts to return to the throne, maybe try to find them and take the horn back because it's like the symbol of the true ruler of the house. Like, that is much more fun than just getting a Horn of Blasting in whatever dungeon you're in. And because I have this little creation pocket, I could even take the Horn of Blasting itself, take its uses, and write that into the history. Like maybe House Landport fell because the Horn of Blasting is really a dangerous object we shouldn't be giving to our players, and they accidentally crumbled their own castle in on itself during some siege when they were trying to use it. And this doesn't really affect the history at large. This is a pinpoint in the broader brush strokes that are my world's history. And you can create multiple of these, right? Like I also have a War of the Gods that occurred even later, sooner, more in the past, that occurred further in the past than this War of the Realm, right? So during this God War, like things were very tumultuous, and the ruins are now like, that's basically my Underdark, is like all of these ruins from the Wars of the Gods, right? And so now when they go into the Underdark, my players are seeing all of these ruins. They're being like, oh, like this is from this god and this is from this god, but this god I've never even heard of, right? But it provides that history and allows me to create stories on the fly that still exist within the wider history. But let's talk about the second method I use, and just for fun, we'll use the Horn of Blasting again. So say maybe you want to give your players a Horn of Blasting, but you don't want it to be like a super special object in your world's history. You just want it to be like another random Horn of Blasting, like maybe a bunch have been made or something. Well, I write what I call dispersal systems or dispersal groups into my lore. And so those are essentially groups that have had a large like economic or cultural or militarial influence on the world. Typically in fantasy, these are elves and dwarves and something related to fire, right? And they disperse magical items through the world in their creation process. So elves are the big disperser in Lord of the Rings, right? Like Bilbo's sword is made by elves. A lot of the dwarves' swords in The Hobbit are made by the elves. The elves reforge Narsil into Anduril. I think that's right. I hope that's right. Man, I'm gonna look like a fool if it's not. But a lot of characters have elven magical objects because elves are the dispersal group of Middle-earth. They disperse the magical items through the world, and when a character finds a magical item, they say, oh, this is of elvish make. This is magic. As an example, in my world, as I mentioned before, I have a order of holy knights. I think a lot of us do. That's where these guys come from, right? And this Holy Order of Knights is one of the dispersal groups of my world. They have existed since before the end of the war. As I said, the gods are the ones who kind of ended the war, and they did it partially through this Order of Holy Knights. So they've existed for a long time. They've been in the world for a long time. And so they have had the chance to create a lot of holy relics that they have left throughout the land as they have failed on missions or sacrificed themselves for whatever cause that they're going after during that part of history. So when my players find this Horn of Blasting, it doesn't have to just be a random Horn of Blasting. It can be a holy relic from this Holy Order of Knights that are running around in my world all the time, right? Because they are everywhere in the world, or at least they have been everywhere at some point. And so there is a chance that there will be a holy relic wherever you are going. This is my dispersal system in my world. I allow these Holy Order of Knights to leave magical objects in whatever dungeon that my players are going into. So when my players are going into a dungeon, they can find a fallen group of those knights, and then they can find this Horn of Blasting that the knights used, and then maybe they died because they accidentally crumbled the dungeon in on themselves, because that's what the Horn of Blasting does. Don't give your players the Horn of Blasting. This is just an example. And now we have context for that dungeon. We have context for why the top of that dungeon caved in, maybe. And we have context for the world. We see that this Holy Order of Knights is everywhere. They've been doing lots of things. The players have maybe encountered fallen members of this order before. They're my dispersal system. And they provide much more history than just a random magical object sitting in a skeletal hand. And for me, these methods are the difference between Strider and the Hobbits just visiting some ruins, and Strider and the Hobbits visiting Weathertop, right? Visiting Amansul. And the difference between Bilbo just finding a magic sword and Bilbo finding a magic elven sword with a specific purpose built in. So hopefully you found some value in this video. A little bit of a shorter one. I think I had to do a couple takes, so my timer's kind of off. But hopefully this allows you to kind of paint within those broader brushstrokes of your world's history and create a little bit more intentionality behind your locations and magical objects. If you found value in this video, you can let me know somehow through a like or a subscribe even. Anything that helps. Man, I feel so weird asking for likes and subs. Even though everybody does it. I don't know why I feel weird about it. Because people have probably, they're probably just looking at the sidebar about what video they'll watch next. But if you want to dole out any of those things, it is the best thing you can do for someone trying to make content on YouTube. So thank you for watching. My name is Wes, this is Prismo, and this is TabletopWriter, where we look at methods of writing through the lens of tabletop gaming. So thank you again. See you next time. So in my own world's lore, there was this huge war, this lore war. That was lame. That was so dumb.